I'm looking at the shaping of the modern female subject, and I'm interested in looking at myth and the significant role it plays within cultures, because all cultures have ancient stories that enable us to understand how cultures have represented themselves, and again, how cultures represent men and women through their myths. And these myths are stories that are handed down generations. They become important meeting points and conduits that allow us to trace the framing of female identities over millennia. And my interest in this area comes from my own identification or my own space as a modern female subject who came of age in independent India and grew up in a post colonial space in which notions of the self and a gendered identity were shaped, formed, and punctuated by a whole category of, by categories or aspects of language, class, caste, economic, and social forces. Of course, when one looks back to take stock of the most impactful forces, it is the world of oral narratives, those of storytelling and then literature, in the form of abridged, translated, and original texts, slowly and closely followed by the world of cinema and television, that arguably remain the most significant of influences. And the other thing that we must always remember is that we do most of our things as a society with secondary occupations through speech, through thought, and through speech. So action is only a later correlate for all those of us who are, within inverted commas, mind workers. Uh, so to look again at what is the role that stories play, what is the role that literature plays, if we were to go back and look for answers in the Republic, written in the 4th century BCE, we would find that Plato, who's written this book and who models his narratives on the basis of the dialogue, which interestingly is the most fabulous way of connecting and making communications. Plato actually says that for the making of an ideal republic. And why is he making an ideal republic? He's saying this is a place where societal justice must be situated. So he says we need to eliminate a lot of things from the ideal republic. And then when he's asked what, he draws attention, among many other things, to the power of the emotive word. So in the ideal world of the republic, the poet or the writer, the playwright, these narrator of epics, they are seen as exerting a great influence upon the imagination of the listener or the viewer through their powerful emotive language. So Plato's argument is that utterances by poets can prove to be dangerous because the poet, through his powerful words and narratives, can color impressionable minds by portraying the vile and immoral behavior of the gods and humans. And I mean, if we look back, look at how many times Indra, for instance, the king of the gods, embarrasses us, and thereby sanctioning such depravity instead of raising the mind to higher truths. So Plato himself uh, comes from a powerful space in Athens, watches the Peloponnesian War, and comes to the conclusion that poets who color the truth have no place in the ideal republic. So he sees poetry as immoral, he sees literature as immoral, and based on falsehood, therefore capable of corrupting minds through what is actually a perversion of reality. Of course, it is left to his disciple or student Aristotle to argue for the importance of the truth uttered by the poet, to draw attention to the cathartic nature of poetry and literature, and to explain that mimesis is not just imitation, but a representation of reality as visualized by the poet or the playwright. So it is Aristotle who makes out a case for the functioning of the poet. And the functioning of the poet, the significance of the poet's worldview, the significance of literature, and argues for the need of imagined stories that can inspire, influence, and guide real lives. So while Aristotle's defense rescues the poet, it is only fair to suggest that very often rules formulated, and when I say rules formulated within inverted commas, we are talking about management, rules formulated on the basis of the thinking of an individual or a group generate their own control and authority. So sometimes a book of codes can be laid out outlining such vision, and history is a very important witness to the fact that ideals set out either by religion or a community or an individual or an oligarchy continue to shape our social and personal lives in ways that need to be examined and analyzed. And this, I would suggest to you, is really the primary purpose of literature, because it allows you to analyze, it allows you to think, it allows you to make connections, and it allows you to interpret for yourself. In a parallel universe in ancient India, there is this very gifted man, Bharata Muni, he is referred to. And there are these apocryphal stories of how he was summoned by the gods and said that, give us entertainment. And he invented the drama. But he wrote this book called the Natya Shastra, of which we have evidence, between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE. And Bharata's Natya Shastra not only argues for the relevance of the aesthetic sentiment, but sets up a palette of rasas, which are to provide both instruction and edification for all manner of citizens, as well as elaborate instructions on the setting up of a stage, the body language of the stage, and the various sanctioned gestures and actions that can be undertaken on stage, to say nothing of the musical instruments and other stage accompaniments. Bharata is also very clear about what cannot be represented on the stage, what cannot be done in the realm of the drama. So the Natya Shastra is a handbook of rules that have been carefully formulated, again by a philosophic poet, exploring the impact of language, music, dance, and drama on the audience. So interestingly, so I'm just suggesting to you that there are literatures, there is material of various kinds, of various categories, there are handbooks, and there is creative fiction. And to this world of sound, storytelling, theater, and text, as modern inhabitants of a global universe, we need to add the realm of cinema and television as formative influences. In fact, the author I worked on for my PhD, Doris Lessing, says at the beginning of the previous century that film is really the medium of the 20th century, in the way that the novel was of a previous century. So when we look at cinema and television as formative influences, because so much of our time is spent now watching what used to be once called the idiot box, we need to retain our role as interpreters and analysts, as dissenters or critics, because it is in the realm of connotative language that we continue to voice and frame the ideals that have so many shortcomings when implemented in the real world. So to go back to my own story and why I am talking about these two texts, as a young person, as a young Tamil person who was raised in New Delhi, several sets of narratives were available to me. Of course, English continued to grow from strength to strength as a medium of influence, of leisure, and of work. And Sanskrit faded into a ritual backdrop despite compulsory and optional lessons, both at school and at college. So it was predominantly Tamil and Hindi traditions that I grew up with and drew upon. Adding to both languages was a formidable set of grandmothers, aunts, and mother, whose lived experience outlined for me the Lakshman Rekhas that I had to take cognizance of. Upper caste Tamil women from shy white households lived tough lives, juggling household work and expenditure while raising sons and daughters, pretty much in the manner of women of similar means in communities and towns and villages all over India. So while I grew up in New Delhi under the watchful eyes of my mother and a benevolent patriarchy at home, there were long summer months when we escaped the brutal heat of New Delhi's summers to shelter in Chennai, or Madras as it was then called, in the sultry summers of the south, punctuated by cool sea breezes that made early mornings and late evenings completely habitable. I mean, this is the only problem with Delhi in the summers before the rains. Within the home, Both in New Delhi and in Chennai, our leisure time was spent listening to stories that my grandmother and mother would narrate or read out in Tamil, familiarizing us with several stories of heroic men and women who peopled the southern lands. So, apart from Nachiketa, I learned about Shivagami, I learned about Savitri, I learned about Gayatri, I learned about Kannagi, I learned about Akka Mahadevi, and I learned about Andal. Our textbooks at school in Delhi were no different. I learned about Sati, Parvati, Mirabai, Panna Devi, Pannabai, Rani Padmini of Chittorgarh, Rani Lakshmi Bai, and a galaxy of other figures, both male and female. Access to television was non-existent. We gathered to watch black and white Chitrahar at our family physician's home once a week for half an hour and got to see 2 films a year at the cinema as an occasional biannual treat. It is as an adult teaching literature at Delhi University that I began to read English translations of both sets of narratives to arrive at the conclusion that the Indian woman was really a very complex product. She led a life always that of a second class citizen, never mind the fact that she could be a princess or a queen. And the visual medium of television and film had also grown exponentially by this time. And it provided us points of entry into discourses set up around epic stories and modern narratives. So, how did television and cinema feed into our cultural consolidation? I would argue that there was a reiteration of certain notions of women: good mothers, faithful wives, disciplined daughters, outside of which remained the evil woman, the other woman, the vamp, the scheming manipulator, the anti heroine who was to be recognized and shunned. There were also the codes of beauty and color, wealth and poverty, talent and the lack of it, and of course, the monitoring of the good woman's sexuality, while simultaneously cinema and film used visual aids to draw attention and tantalize the viewer with body parts of women and move the narrative to usually unnecessary exposure of flesh. And they did this trying to circumvent the moral censure boards, simultaneously frustrating young women in their experimentations with their clothes and bodies and their lives. The rules in cinema were also fairly clear cut by now. Premarital sex was out. The hero could celebrate the female body, ranging from Kajarare Nayan to Anchals in which halchals existed. But other than a glimpse of the midriff and a bare arm, the good heroine displayed coy virtue, usually telling the prurient camera, which when it asked Choli ke piche kya hai, that the Choli housed her dil, not her breasts. So cinema managed to create a new woman of feeling and emotion who proudly wore her heart under her choli. And cinema gave us fair and voluptuous women filled with sentiment through which they proved their devotion to their husbands, families, cruel in-laws, were selfless mothers battling against the state. That was a welfare state only on paper. So if the beautiful Shakuntala, capable of bearing a male heir, was the icon that captured the European mind as an understanding of Indian womanhood in the 19th century, nationalism and independence conjured up for us a chaste older woman, Ma, who embodied the motherland, Bharat Ma, whose commitment to the state and family and the domestic world was unparalleled. This telegenic capture of female identity remains most compelling. Coupled with the older mythic roles that poets allotted to women, the stage continued to be rearranged for the shaping and sculpting of the 21st century female subject in an exciting new avatar, one that breathed color and sound and movement into the older mythologies. For instance, just look at how the role model of the emotive mother in our private lives is offered up for consumption to all of us as we grow up. You know, you have this very belligerent Amitabh Bachchan who's having a showdown with his brother, and he's telling him, "Aaj mere paas building hai, property hai, bank balance hai, bangla hai." And this always used to puzzle me because bangla also meant Bengali, but here he's talking about the bungalow. Bangla hai, gaadi hai, kya hai? Kya hai tumhare paas? And at this, he receives this very quiet answer from Shashi Kapoor, who says, "Mere paas maa hai," because the mother is not living with the wealthier son. So the audience stands up and claps and catcalls in cinema halls all over the country. So once again, the emotional sustenance provided by the mother reiterates the ethical superiority of the son who had chosen to live by the values the hardworking mother had espoused. In our daily lives, where mothers lived in houses and had access to transport, women's work is apotheosized, usually with reference to cooking. So there is the unparalleled taste of maa ke haath ki bani garam roti, if she was Hindi speaking, or the kai manam, and this is a very Tamil expression. It's actually kai means hand and manam means fragrance. So the attention is being drawn to the fragrance of the hands that provide these delicious flavors into cooked food and create such delicious food. Meanwhile, what is it that were offered to our long-suffering mothers or hardworking mothers in the difficult domestic spaces that were available to them? They were inspired by the Sita story in their years of growing up as an antidote to their personal suffering, which was in turn offered to us as young girls when we quarreled or complained or were belligerent. Look at Sita, one grandmother would opine. She was the daughter of a great king and married to Rama, an avatar of Vishnu himself. She went on the forest with Rama uncomplainingly. She was so beautiful that Ravana abducted her and wanted her to be his wife. Yet, as a Pativrata wife, she could not think of anyone other than Rama. Her monogamous conjugal commitment reunited her with Rama, the Agni Pariksha notwithstanding. Agni Parikshas were good event, grandmother felt, because Sita's purity was established. However, shortly after they went back to Ayodhya, a washerman thrashed his wife, because wife beating is sanctioned culturally everywhere, suspecting her of infidelity, and said he could not be an accepting husband like Rama. This apparently convinced the blameless king to banish her all over again, this time to a different forest where she delivered babies and raised her two children single-handedly with help from a rishi who could see the future worth of a male progeny. So Agni Parikshas, as we can see, only had a limited shelf life. Sita never complained, said grandmother authoritatively. You must learn from Sita's patience and quietness. Young persons are not really equipped to ask questions that come very easily to an older intellect. If one questioned Sita's self-subsuming nature that bordered on a sort of immolation, for what else would we call a woman who jumped into a fire and emerged unscathed? In Europe, she would have been declared a witch. If she did not die at the stake, then of course she would be put to death immediately thereafter in public view. In India, this did not happen to Sita. The first time she came back into the realm of the living and tried to rebuild her life. The second time, there was no corporeal body. Mother Earth swallowed up her unfortunate daughter. So the storytellers inform us. Sita was subsequently deified and she became a point of reference and was set up as an impossible role model. What are the life lessons that Sita, as an icon, offers to young women from all over India? What is the homegrown ingot of precious understanding that Sita bestows upon her innumerable sisters raised through the length and breadth of India? How is the Sita image created, cultivated, and yoked into the feminine unconscious through the length and breadth of a country? Innumerable women from different parts of India, how do they respond to her? In fact, until Nina Peli made Sita sing the blues, patriarchal wisdom barely imagined that Sita could possibly have anything to complain about, since after all, she was married to none other than Maryada Purushottam Ram. So you see, the second class citizen. And then, of course, there was the manner of deportment which Sita carried out so well. She never argued, was seldom heard, and was punished with instant karma for accusing Lakshman, how faultless they were, of harboring evil designs when he expressed doubt about the authenticity of Maricha's cries for help that were meant to sound like Rama calling out in distress. So Sita, by speaking crossly and in a forward fashion to Lakshmana, in a sense was responsible for her own abduction by Ravana, much in the manner of modern young women who have erased Lakshman Rekhas by eating chow mein and speaking on cell phones, wearing clothes that are revealing and going out with men who are not their fathers, brothers, or husbands, and thereby inviting all manner of immediate punishment upon themselves. So when you look at this whole story of ideal deportment, how should women conduct themselves? You're constantly told, look at what Sita's error cost her when she crossed the Lakshman Rekha. And this is reinforced from another text, the Mahabharata, where the highly educated, learned, trained, and skilled polyandrous Draupadi laughs in the hall at Indraprastha when Duryodhan mistakes a real pool for crystal and falls into the water. This must have been comic and must have triggered off Draupadi's visceral funny bone. Her laughter at the comic figure Duryodhana cut ricocheted off the walls of the women's quarters and was replicated and relayed in turn by the laughter of her ladies in waiting. This, an alert aunt would reiterate, triggered Duryodhana's rage. Such were the red alerts issued to us as young women. Do not provoke men and do not make them angry. Even the brilliance of a Draupadi failed when she angered the Skayan of the Kuru dynasty. If any one of us ventured feebly that there was never a working relationship between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and this was all about the business of money management and resource management from the very beginning, and that Duryodhana could also not win her hand at the Swayamvar, stern looks from one or other wise fount of experience was enough to silence us, as we took on identities proffered to us from older tales without demurring. The prescribed qualities of the pantheon of women in our stories, who were usually from economically well-off houses, was that they had to be beautiful. And then all that was required was that a handsome prince, substitute prince with propertied high-income group employee, who would come by so that they could be betrothed to him, marry, and live happily ever after. The caveat being that it was up to the woman to remain compliant, stoic, chaste, and unlaughing throughout this period. In case you think that this paradigm of femaleness is exclusively Indian, I'm going to read out to you two stanzas from W.B. Yeats, who won the Nobel Prize before Tagore. So Yeats's Prayer for My Daughter, written in 1919, when his daughter was born, that's 102 years from today, will demonstrate how the lines from this poem will demonstrate how the submissive daughter with no mind of her own and even less preferences is the virtuous object of desire across cultures. Yeats, for instance, actually says, I don't want a beautiful daughter because she will make a stranger's eye distraught. So Yeats is aware of the Ravan syndrome of the man who will come and abduct a beautiful woman. So he says, in courtesy, I'd have her chiefly learned. Hearts are not had as a gift, but hearts are earned by those that are not entirely beautiful. Yet many that have played the fool for beauty's very self has charm made wise. And many a poor man that has roved, men are allowed to rove, mind you, loved and thought himself beloved, from a glad kindness cannot take his eyes. May she become a flourishing hidden tree, that all her thoughts may like the linnet be, and have no business but dispensing round their magnanimities of sound. Nor but in merriment begin a chase, nor but in merriment a quarrel. Oh, may she live like some green laurel, rooted in one dear perpetual place. So this pattern of compulsory heterosexuality that also prescribes a code of conduct for women, first in the private sphere and later in the public sphere, as Yeats's poem also makes very clear, forms the mainstream cultural traditions in both the Hindi-speaking North and the Tamil-speaking South. It is possible, perhaps, to compile a collection of tongues and languages and shared commonalities that could be linked to these two linguistic groups. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm just going to, for this presentation, I would like to draw attention to two narratives that I grew up with. One is the story of Kannagi, an icon of Tamil literature, and the other is the story of Rani Padmini of Chittorgarh. And I'm choosing Padmini over Mirabai because, unlike Mirabai, who was allegedly a real person, who wrote radical poetry, who sang radical bhajans and made a life transformative both for herself and for countless women, Kannagi and Padmini were fictionalized heroines from two works of literature, namely Silapadiharam by Ilango Adigai who's a prince, and Padmavati by Malik Muhammad Jayasi. So the love story of Kovalan and Kannagi, enshrined in Silapadiharam, was written around the 4th century CE by Illangavadigai. And this continues to be debated because people say, no, 1st century, then people say, no, 6th century. And this is a ongoing academic pursuit. Kannagi and Kovalan's story spans 3 Tamil kingdoms belonging to the Chola, Chera, and Pandya periods and presents them as contemporaneous. So Kovalan and Kannagi are the daughter and son of rich merchants in Puhar. And Kannagi is married off to Kovalan at a very young age. And both Kovalan and Kannagi join the ranks of prepubescent lovers, such as Romeo and Juliet, and remain immortalized in cultural memory as young lovers. Chennai today boasts of a very powerful Kannagi statue that dominates a beachfront. And Kannagi continues to be venerated as a symbol of female conjugal fidelity and chastity, otherwise known as Karpa, and remains to date Tamil Nadu's abiding female icon who is revered as a chaste wife and as an epitome of Tamil womanhood. In Tamil Nadu and Kerala, she is worshipped as Bhagavati and Devi. And in parts of Sri Lanka, Kannagi is referred to as the goddess Patini by the Sinhala Buddhists and as Kannagi Amman by the Sinhala Hindus. And she's also seen as Bhadrakali, so Kannagi is actually our local version of Bhadrakali, a virulent form of Shakti who is supposed to be awe-inspiring. So Kannagi's story is that she is married to Kovalan, who abandons her because he sees this really beautiful woman who sings very well and who's also a dancer and who is somebody who is known as the Kulvatu, and he fathers a child with her. So when I discuss Silapadiharam with female undergraduates, they can't understand her at all. So the questions I'm usually asked are, why doesn't she divorce Kovalan? They're very exasperated. He's such a loser. He's such a two-timer. And it usually takes a while before we can follow Kannagi and Kovalan through their misadventures and his death at Madurai. Meanwhile, Kannagi sets the city afire with her rage, kills a king and his wife, and a lot of people in positions of power who abuse their authority, and ends her journey in Vanchi, where she's actually, or Vanchi, where she's actually, taken away and where she becomes a sort of goddess as well. Kannagi's loyalty to her husband who cheats on her and her commitment to him is part of the trajectory of a chaste wife that continues to be a significant value in modern India. Conjugal fidelity and chastity remain the tropes that govern and fashion women's images even in contemporary times. Evidence of this can be found within the rules inscribed in the domestic sphere that continue to be buttressed by powerful men and women in their public life and then slide into the collective unconscious through a reading of older texts that continue to be amalgamated in modern film and television serials. Let me just draw your attention to one of Gandhi's essays about the extraordinary Hindu woman who possessed the ability to freeze assailants in their track with her virtuous indignation, thereby deflecting their lust and rapaciousness. And Gandhi's argument probably draws from figures of self-effacement whom we find in the myth of figures such as Kannagi or generations of numberless women who apparently voluntarily submitted themselves to the flames of Sati and Johar. So I'm just going to quote these lines from the Harijan, and these are Gandhi's words. Quote, "It is physically impossible to violate a woman against her will. The outrage takes place only when she gives way to fear or does not realize her moral strength. If she cannot meet the assailant's physical might, her purity will give her the strength to die before he succeeds in violating herself. For example, Sita." So this is the Harijan, 14 January 1940, when we are about 7.5 years from becoming a democratic nation. When a woman is assaulted, her primary duty is self-protection. God has given her nails and teeth. She must use them with all her strength and if need be, die in the effort. This is the Harijan, 1st March 1942, and we are inching 5 years away from independence at this point. And I'm sure that all of us as women who have spent valuable time manicuring our nails and painting them and looking at our hands, which are incidentally also televised as objects of great beauty and filmed as objects of great importance. I mean, who doesn't remember Kaho Na Pyar Hai and the nail polish and lipstick that becomes so important in that movie? Would have never thought that this is what women have been given nails and teeth for. So these two sentences that I just read out to, which were written by Mahatma Gandhi, draw attention to the overriding importance that is given to female chastity in Indian society. And his emphasis on female chastity and purity becomes very worrying, because his solution for the helpless woman under sexual assault is to die before the violation can take place. And this is a very traditional view of what women should do when they are sexually assaulted. So this is akin to harakiri or johar, although there's possibly some kind of valor in harakiri, although the end result is the same. In the days of armed sexual assaults and gang rape perpetuated on women, the Gandhian solution is woefully inadequate. Yet it continues to be mouthed by women politicians. The late Sushma Swaraj, after whom a new university, a new college is being founded and named in Delhi, when she spoke about the brutality inflicted on Nirbhaya after she was gang raped, she refers to Nirbhaya as a zinda lash, for that is the status of a violated woman who has been stripped of her chastity, which continues to be seen as an exclusively female virtue, because I'm no longer talking 1940 and 1942. I'm really giving you evidence from how women are looked at in 2013. Also, it's important for us to recognize that chastity is as a virtue has been imposed upon women since times immemorial, and has been the single most important cause of women's degraded status in society, one that has been recreated endlessly by the patriarchal powers that be. The idea of female virtue offered up by our epics in the instance of Sita and then through the Kannagi story continue to grip the imagination and occupy center stage when it comes to demarcating women's roles. So widows become an unacceptable surplus, because what role do these women have now that their husbands are dead? The divorcee who could not keep her husband is also viewed with suspicion, since her sexual proclivities remain suspect. And unlike the older widow, she cannot be tonsured and reclothed unattractively. Arguably, it's therefore useful then to look at Sati and Johar as rites of passage that allow patriarchal authorities to monitor and control the surplus of women. And Sati herself, Shiva's first wife, is a mythical figure who immolates herself because her father insults her husband. For an ideal woman, even an insult is enough to lay down her life. Our most well-known recent Sati happened in 1987. And Sati temples today remain part of the topography of Rajasthan, especially Junjunu. It is on occasions like this, when the arguments refer to what happened amidst the gods, that I begin to understand fully what Plato meant when he spoke of the malevolence in the heavens and among humans that could easily become normative. So I'd just like to go now and look briefly at the story of Padmavati, a poem written in 1540 over 57 cantos, comprising a large number of stanzas. And I must confess that I have only read an English translation of the whole poem, which is about 400 pages. And this is a translation made by A.G. Sherif in 1944, published by the Royal Asiatic Society. Those of you who want to look at this, it's available on the World Wide Web. So Padmavati, that was written in 1540, has these two women characters. I mean, there is Nagamati, there are many women characters, but there are two queens. So there is Nagamati, who is the chief queen of Ratan Sen. And Ratan Sen then is told by a particular parrot about Padmavati of Sinhala, who lives in Sri Lanka. And Ratan Sen falls completely and totally in love with the description that the parrot gives him of Padmavati. So I mean, please understand how magnificent this is. Parrot doesn't have a film, doesn't have a photograph, cannot offer a video, but it just uses the power of description, the power of sound and language to convince Ratan Sen of the beauty of Padmavati. So this is a long epic where Padmavati is being quoted by a king who falls in love, a king who lives in the north of India and who seeks out this princess from modern day Sri Lanka. And she's referred to as a lotus girl of Sinhala. She returns to Chittorgarh, and while they're returning and crossing the seas, she is separated from Ratan Sen because of the storm, and because she can't see him, she is ready to become a sati. Newly married, few days old, for her, there is no meaning to her life if her husband is not there. So she says, I'm ready to die on the pyre. And this woman with this kind of training comes to Chittorgarh. And again, there is somebody called Alauddin, who's the Alauddin Shah, the text says, the emperor of Delhi, who has 1,600 queens, whom he has brought from 7 continents that he has apparently pillaged. And he gets to hear about Padmavati. How does he hear about Padmavati? There is a malevolent being called Raghav. And what Raghav does is to make some mistake. He's the court advisor and the poet. And because he doesn't perform very well, Ratan Sen decides that the best way to manage him is to sack him, which, by the way, is a terrible plan, because what Raghav does immediately is to rush off to describe to Alauddin the beauty of Padmini. And Padmini, this is something that I want us all to know about older literature. I mean, there is a lot of narrative that is celebrating female beauty. It's very sensuous. It's very erotic, the poetry. And in fact, I find now that students who are politically empowered actually comment on this and say, but this is not fair to the woman, because they are protesting against what is the male gaze. But I also want to point out that this male gaze celebrates the female form. There is really no return. The female does not in turn offer a celebration of the male form, as it were. But so what she really does is really celebrate whatever it is that the male is setting out to do. So anyway, after this protracted story, in the story, Alauddin doesn't get to see Padmavati. She comes to him in a vision, but he started a battle and there's lots of crossfighting going on, because, believe it or not, those of you who only seen the movie Padmavat, Ratan Sen is killed by a king called Devpal, and when he goes to attack him, because Devpal has actually tried to send somebody to Padmavati called Kumudini, and who has told her that why don't you go and meet Alauddin, because finally the pleasures of the body are very, very available for a very limited time, and you will lose desire, you will grow old, you'll become yellow. Padmavati is so angry when she hears this, because please remember, she's a chaste wife. She actually tonsures Kumudini and drives her out of the palace. But after all this happens, while Ratan Sen attacks and kills Devpal, he has this spear which is lined with poison, with which he pierces Ratan Sen. So Ratan Sen also comes back and dies. And these two women, Nagamati and Padmavati, both of them perform sati. And incidentally, Nagamati and Padmavati actually have what would now be called a cat fight. Nagamati is apparently very dark and beautiful. So one must say of Jayasri's text that he did not, talk about white as being better than black, which is a new point of comparison that we now have in modern times. And it is a king who comes and separates them and tells them that he loves them both very dearly and they are very important to him. So at the end, when both the queens perform sati, all their men are dead, and Emperor Alauddin the Shah now says, vanity of the world, throws up the earth, and the poet remarks that the desires of the world will remain until ashes fall upon them. So in this story, which ends with the larger frame of mortality, Padmavati and Nagamati and all their ladies in waiting in Sinhala and Chittorgarh, and 1,600 women in the emperor's harem from 7 continents, all of them are objects of great beauty, desired and described. Padmini's beauty is first described by the parrot and then by Raghav Chetan, poet and Pandit and advisor of Ratan Sen's court. And each, by the parrot and by Ratan Sen, each part of her body is described expansively and erotically. So Padmavati is presented as a very sensuous woman with an elephant gait, which, by the way, was popularized by M.F. Hussain, who made a film called Gajagamini. And this is something that was sanctioned to her by custom. So she is chosen by Ratan Sen. She's wooed by him. She pledges herself to this king who courts her and actually becomes a yogi for her. So but these two women who are rivals go together as queen consorts to their Johor. So this is really these are the two oldest stories that I wanted to talk about. One located in 6th century CE and the other one in the 16th century CE. But I wanted to also show the connection between Padmavati and a serial that I saw on Disney Hotstar. It's a Tamil serial called Bharati Kannamma, which was released in 2019. And I'm just offering it up for discussion as an instance of a typical serial that provides an insight into the associations with the name of Bharati. Bharati was Tamil Nadu's famous poet and freedom fighter who spoke for the rights of Tamil women, spoke against child marriage, and he also was very much in love with his wife, who was called Chellamma. So he wrote a lot of poems describing Chellamma and her beauty and her attractiveness. And apparently, after Bharati's death, these poems were published by his brother. But the name Chellamma was changed to Kannamma. And it's really interesting because Bharati's brother felt that Kannamma was a more sophisticated name and that Chellamma was a very crude name. And both the names really mean beloved or dear one. So the writers of this serial who pitched this as a story dealing with the trials of a woman's life play with the title, teasingly evoking memories of poet Subramaniam Bharati and his wife Chellamma, in praise of whose beauty and virtues he wrote several poems. And there's actually a song, part of the theme of this film, in which Bharati is composing. Bharati, the character in the serial, is composing a song on Kannamma and he's calling her Chellamma. So this is really, so, in tracing the love story of Bharati, Bharati falls in love with a dark-skinned, illiterate, but golden-hearted girl. And the narrative lists the tribulations that women go through in patriarchal societies that discriminate against them on the basis of their gender, ability, skin color. So dark-skinned Kannamma's mother dies when she's born, and she's raised by a stepmother who has a fair daughter. So fair stepsister plots with mother against dark stepsister, on whose side is a hapless father, but he's unable to help his dark daughter against evil wife and daughter who terminate her schooling. Nevertheless, Bharati falls in love with this girl, inspired by her valor and ethical values, and marries her against his mother's wishes. And once she marries him, the woes of the world break around her shoulders because her mother-in-law is humiliating her for lack of education and dark skin. But Kannamma conquers all resistance and discovers that she is pregnant. And at this point, the mother-in-law is embracing her with open arms because there is a possibility of progeny. But suddenly into the narrative enters the villain, somebody more potent than the first wife of Ratan Sen, who is a scheming female doctor, also the anti-heroine. And she poisons Bharati's mind and says that, look, you are important. How does she know this? Because she's engineered an accident, at the end of which she fakes these tests to show Bharati that he can not ever conceive, he cannot ever engender a child. So Bharati turns around, accuses Kannamma of not being faithful to him, of being unchaste. So she gets very angry and leaves the house. When she's pregnant, she doesn't go to a doctor, doesn't go to a gynecologist. So, she's lying unconscious in a hospital. Her mother-in-law comes to visit her. 2 babies are born. And there's plenty of drama because Bharati actually delivers 1 baby and leaves as social service, although he hates her and hates her unchaste behavior. And the mother takes one of the twins because she feels that this way she'll be able to unite the father with his child, and then it will be economically very viable for Kannamma to bring up one twin in poverty, one of the twins in poverty instead of 2. So, so the chaste wife is played by Kannamma, to the hilt this particular role. She refuses maintenance, refuses childcare support, she refuses medical attention, and maybe the narrators are drawing attention to the flawed legal and medical systems in India that always fail us, fail everybody who's in desperate need of these services. But the story continues for 8 years with twists and turns, because having abandoned the possibility of legal settlement altogether, the script writers move from one 20-minute episode to another, stretching credibility, and introduce us to fashionably dressed women of various ages who have no occupation, no vocation, or employable skills. Kannamma is a great cook and a seamstress. Her mother-in-law runs a cosmetic business by proxy, because she spends all her time worrying about Kannamma and worrying about the kidnapped daughter whom she is raising. And Bemba is the evil female doctor, another study in misogyny, because despite being a doctor, she is jealous and unchaste. She lusts after Bharati, who's a married man. So she's really some sort of, Surpanakha prototype. And she's ready to murder anyone who comes in her way. She also employs hitmen to kidnap and kill. So as per this story, there can be no women of intelligence in this new world, and women must be evaluated on the basis of their chastity, which is their raison d'etre for living. So one thing the rule book is clear about is, in all these modern narrations, there is for the modern Hindu male the Ram model of monogamy, which incidentally is optional. The Krishna model exists and is acceptable. For our stories of gods and kings say so, do they not? For the woman, there is no choice. And as I pointed out to you, Kumudini and Padmavati, who comes to, ask Padmavati to go and meet the emperor and enjoy the pleasure of the flesh with him, is tortured and humiliated and driven out of Chittorgarh. So this disappointing take on older narratives play into the Indian story of nationalism and women's freedom and rights in a modern state, and provide an instance of how popular narratives continue to shape and influence female identities, unable to create role models for modern Indian women in contemporary times. If Bharati Kannamma is a continuing saga of modern misdirected misogyny, what is even more worrying is the popular response that was elicited by the ancient story of Padmavati, the fabled queen of Chittorgarh, whose act of community immolation or johar formed part of our history lessons about barbaric and savage India, where women had no rights over their bodies or lives at any point in their lives. How do we assess the response to the movie Padmavat that was released in 2017 in contemporary times? When this 16th century text, Padmavati, was made into the film Padmavat in the 21st century, it became a site of conflagration. And it ended in generating a past, instead of generating a past in which Hindus and Muslims coexisted within a complex matrix, the film split wide open the differences in religion and exacerbated gender roles and identities. Stones were thrown at unsuspecting school children traveling home in a school bus. Women from Rajput communities came out in large numbers in various districts, saying that the screening of the film where a Hindu woman was being viewed lecherously by a stereotyped savage Muslim was an insult to Hindu womanhood. All the Rajput women protesting were only too willing to sacrifice their lives in order to avenge their honor. They were ready to commit johar if the film was not banned. Meanwhile, a bounty of 5 lakhs was offered for for cutting off Deepika Padukone's nose. And state authorities and law and order administrators fell silent as they watched the uproar from the sidelines, along with hapless women and children, who were definitely unwilling to pay the price of undertaking johar in order to mitigate the damage done to their honor by Sanjay Leela Bhansali. The Karni Sena went on the rampage and spoke about the damage to Rajput well-being and the loss of Rajput dignity, while the CBFS, the Central Board of Film Certification, got Deepika's midriff digitally covered in order to respect the sentiment of viewers who ostensibly find it difficult to view parts of a woman's waist and stomach exposed on the screen. Our medium of learning or exchange, where you can have a dialogue, has changed from a literary text and a long narrative poem has been replaced by the audiovisual genre of the film. What has not changed, however, is the limited roles envisaged for women over the centuries. The nature of policing has also changed. While erotic descriptions and celebration of the female form abound in the texts of Silapadiharam and Padmavati, the celluloid film industry responsible for itemizing and commodifying women is now being policed by the moral brigade that has very different, definite opinions about what women should wear, whom they should interact with, and whom they should speak to. What we are getting now is unidimensional portrayals of women in black and white who are either virtuous or wicked as per prescriptive norms. In fact, both Madhavi and Silapadiharam and Nagamani and Padmavati are fleshed out and well delineated characters who are allowed enough space by the male imaginations that constructed them. Madhavi is a figure admired by the public in Puhar, while Nagamati is the first queen whom King Ratan Sen continues to love and respect. Oddly, as we move away from the trappings of religious formulations of women's roles and make sense of women's rights in a modern democracy, we find our hands full and furiously engaged in fending off the increasingly misogynistic practice that has become part of our populistic democratic everydayness in the decades of the 21st century. Simone de Beauvoir said in a previous century, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Maybe to this poignant discovery of hers, we should add lines of our own. One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman informed by text, context, technology, and politics in a patriarchal world that continually raises its hackles when the subject of an inclusive world for women is raised. Thank you.